Well, good morning. I'm Steve Cheney, the CEO of the American Security Project, and welcome to what we think is a really great day focused on energy security and national security. This has long been an issue for the American Security Project. When we were founded in 2005 by Kerry, Hale, Rudd, this was one of the basic principles, that there's a nexus between security and energy, and also incorporated with that is climate change. When they first started us in 2005, anytime you talk climate change, a lot of times you usually thought Greenpeace and Sierra Club and Left Wing, and particularly in the case of Kerry and Hale, they thought, geez, let's look at this from a factual perspective and then look at the energy piece to the puzzle. Can we not tie in the national security part of that and talk rationally, maybe, to those on the Hill and to the American public about energy security and climate change? I think we've had some success. We are trying hard to push this issue. We've had some good work on the Hill of late, but we're getting a little more inspired given what's going on in the Middle East lately, talking about energy security. And of course, when you tie in things like fracking, and people talk energy independence, and Keystone Pipeline, I mean, there are so many pieces to this puzzle. And we're not going to come down on a hard right side or hard left side. We're much more moderate in that approach at ASP. So we put together a number of panels today to talk energy from a variety of perspectives, and I think you're really going to be entertained. These are great panels, fabulous folks that we've got here. I appreciate all of you all coming. We are going to record it. We'll put it up on our website probably tonight or tomorrow. We'll tweet it as well. It's all on the record. And I think we've got a good hour plus, maybe an hour and a half, a little less. Each of the speakers will probably talk for 10 or 15 minutes. And I'm going to turn it over to the chair, which is Marik String from the Atlantic Council. So Marik, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Steve, and thanks to Andrew Holland and Paul Hamill and ASP, the entire team, for putting together this very comprehensive, timely conference. So I'm pleased to chair the first panel this morning, which is going to focus on natural gas and LNG, and specifically how you might use American LNG and know-how to build a world market. So I'm going to first introduce my co-panelists. To my right is Chris Guith. He's the Senior Vice President for Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy. Prior to joining the Chamber, Chris served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy. Next to Chris is Andrew Ware. He serves as the Director of Strategic Projects for Cheniere Energy. He has over 15 years of experience in the natural gas sector. As many of you know, Cheniere is really at the front lines of the U.S. LNG export debate, and received the first license to export LNG to non-free trade agreement countries. And at the end of the panel is Jennifer Harris. Jennifer is a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to joining the Council, she was a member of the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department, and she was responsible for global markets, geoeconomic issues, and energy security. So to begin the discussion, to sort of frame the debate, I'll offer a few opening points about some key ways to think about how LNG, American LNG, and the prospect of increased exports of LNG could affect geopolitics and geoeconomics. So I think the first basic starting point is the fact that traditionally international gas markets lack competition. This is an important point to consider when we're thinking about LNG compared to other types of energy exports. As many of you know, gas is still sold traditionally by pipeline under long-term contracts, which generally are indexed to oil prices. And when we're thinking about the geopolitics of LNG, this has a couple important consequences. First, the more gas, even as more gas goes on the market, this doesn't necessarily mean that prices internationally paid by consumers, particularly many U.S. allies, will go down. In fact, as gas goes on the market, a lot of prices tend to stay the same, though there's some pressure on that, which we'll discuss a bit more as the panel progresses. The second important consequence of this is that contract terms still depend predominantly on political relationships with suppliers. So most poignantly, Russia is racking up a number of supply disruptions to a variety of its neighbors amid the crisis in Ukraine. By some estimates, Russia's cut off supplies to its neighbors over 25 times over the last 10 to 15 years. And there's no reason, for example, under a functioning market, why Lithuania would pay twice the amount for its gas from Russia than would Germany, given that Lithuania is actually closer to the supply in Russia than is Germany. So the second point I'd like to make is that the most significant effect of more US LNG coming on the market is that it could create more global liquidity and drive down prices, giving any consumer, regardless of where the consumer is, more options. A lot of the US LNG export discussions have been accelerated recently by Ukraine. I think it's important, there are folks who say US LNG makes no difference for Ukraine, and US molecules could never reach Ukraine. There are those who say that's not necessarily true, US molecules could reach Ukraine, but I think the important point to make is that irrespective of the outcome of that debate, more US LNG on the market creates liquidity, drives down prices, and gives Ukraine and other vulnerable consumers options which they wouldn't otherwise have. The third point that I'll make is that the US gas export regime is coming under increased pressure, which is, I think, one of the reasons why this panel is taking place. There are a number of remaining obstacles to US LNG exports. As most of you know, under the Natural Gas Act, which is a somewhat antiquated law that was the relevant provisions of which were passed during a time of gas scarcity, not gas abundance like today. Under this act, it requires a public interest determination for exports to any non-free trade agreement country. This has been a very cumbersome, slow, opaque process by the Department of Energy. The department has approved fewer than 10 licenses, while around 24 still are pending in the queue. There have been some important attempts to reform this regime, which hopefully we can talk about. Particularly, Andrew can probably share some perspective on how HR 6, a recent bill passed by the House of Representatives, could be one step towards reforming this regime. And I think most importantly, perhaps from a trade perspective, the position that the United States takes on LNG exports is increasingly inconsistent with the positions that we stake out in other international venues. I'll end my comments with just one quote, which I think illustrates how dissonant our U.S. Natural gas export policy is. And the quote is, "No country can hoard its raw materials from the global marketplace at the expense of other WTO partners." And this might sound like a criticism of U.S. LNG export policy, but rather this statement was leveled against China by the U.S. and the EU in a recent WTO case, which the United States and EU won, challenging China's own rare earth export restrictions. So a similar type of natural resource that China has placed export restrictions on. So I think that's going to be an increasingly important point to consider as the Senate potentially takes up legislation to reform the U.S. Natural gas export regime. So I'll turn it now over to my co-panelists. First, Chris, what are your perspectives on the geopolitics, the energy security aspects, and the sort of political debate surrounding LNG exports.
So I come from the chamber, and I say that only to make the point that we're a very large trade association, like the largest one in the country. And we have very diverse membership, which is to say that not all of my members agree with the chamber's position supporting free export of, or free trade, shall we say, of energy commodities. I think when you look at LNG, I mean, from our standpoint, this was an obvious debate that we were going to have 5 or 6 years ago. As soon as we saw methane start to move towards a glut position in the market, it was clear that there was It was clear that we were going to be testing these provisions that prevent the free export. And when you're working with the local chambers across the country, especially in areas like northeastern Pennsylvania and Marcellus, or in the Haynesville, down in Louisiana, Barnett, where this all started in Texas, this glut has really had a pronounced impact, meaning that the drilling rigs just went away. And it's not to say that this is 1981 and we're having a complete bust within the market. It's we have this artificial constraint, because we all know that demand is there around the world. There were just these provisions that prevented the free trade. I mean, obviously there are logistical concerns as well. I mean, you can't just turn the spigot on tomorrow, as we'll hear from Andrew and their travails down at Sabine Pass. But the bottom line is that even you look at Pennsylvania right now, there's hundreds of wells that haven't been completed. They've been drilled, but are literally just sitting there as inventory, waiting for the price to inch up to make it economically wise for that particular company to connect it through the gathering line to a trunk line, and ultimately get it to a point where they can get the price that they're looking for. And there is an environmental component here too. I mean, I saw a statistic last week that I haven't verified yet, but over $1 billion, the statistic was that over $1 billion in gas had been flared in the previous 5 years. It certainly sounds plausible if you look at the amount of gas that's being produced. But the bottom line is, if we were to have an unconstrained market, a lot less of that gas would be flared, because there would be even more of a market incentive to bring it to market. Ultimately, this is as much about politics as it is about economics, and I think it's clear with due respect to Cheniere and Sempra and now Dominion, LNG exports was literally the undercard for crude exports. I mean, from the beginning. I think it made the debate a little bit easier because it wasn't quite as high profile, but we're still not ready for prime time to have the debate on crude. But I think a lot of the arguments that have come out and a lot of the prologue that the LNG debate has brought to Congress, to the policy debates like this discussion right now, and even within the administration, is very important in moving the overall debate on energy exports. I mean, and politically, I think, to reference your point about HR 6, I mean, when you have two candidates in the purple state, being Colorado, competing with each other to lay claim to who's more pro-exports, I think that kind of surmises where we've been, or where the point that we've arrived to in this debate, in that it's not the political liability in very, very many places. In fact, it's quite the political liability to be seen as constraining the free trade, because the people on the ground see in real life what a artificially constrained market looks like, and they know that when that market is opened, you're bringing a lot more jobs and a lot more government revenue to the table that right now is being left on the table. And ultimately, from the chamber perspective, this is about free trade, as where I started. Within the confines of the WTO and its predecessor at GATT, it is blatantly a violation for any country to treat one WTO partner differently than the other when it comes to exports. And that's exactly what we're doing on gas. It's what we're doing on crude and a number of other items. which is to say that our policy within the LNG sphere of treating one WTO member who happens to have a free trade agreement with us different from another WTO member who doesn't is an absolute violation. And as Marik pointed out, we have already taken China, we've filed a complaint against China twice now, and one successfully. The first one on bauxite, and then we used the precedent there with some of our international partners to bring a complaint against them for rare earth elements. There are two, I think, very interesting points, especially in the latter one, is that there is a defense, or there is an exception, I should say, within the WTO that says you as a WTO member can conserve natural resources, which China used that defense. And what the WTO correctly said was, you can conserve natural resources, but you can't do it by saying, I'm going to import to him but not to him, or to them but not to them. You can conserve them by saying, we are going to reserve 90% of all of our production for domestic use. Within that 10% that you export, you have to treat every WTO member equally. And the second aspect that I think is somewhat telling is it wasn't just the absolute provision or prohibition of export to certain countries that the WTO found to be a violation. It was the delay in the actual process. So there are absolute parallels between the way that we are treating gas, and to a lesser extent oil, and what China did, that we took them to we filed a complaint at the WTO and successfully won. I mean, the politics of the WTO are as such that I doubt that we will see another country file a complaint against the US, but we are absolutely liable at this point, and I'd be very surprised if a complaint was filed that we would be able to successfully defend it. So I think that those arguments coming from foreign capitals around the world are having as much of an impact on the administration's decisions as a lot of the noise that comes from within the Beltway. I mean, having our allies say we need this gas, please start exporting it, and having people who may not be our allies or maybe competitors, shall we say, saying, US, you're such hypocrites. How can you go around the world wagging your finger at all the rest of us saying drop your tariffs and drop your restraints on free trade when you're doing the same exact thing? It really lessens the moral authority that we have to be the arbiter of free trade. And so with that, I'll end my comments.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And Andrew, from an industry perspective, what are the hurdles for more investment in LNG infrastructure? And you could comment also on how HR 6, as many of you may know, it requires the Department of Energy to basically make a decision on a pending license within 30 days, so it doesn't drastically alter the export regime, but it, in theory, might accelerate it. Your perspective on what that effect would be for industry?
Thank you, Marik. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to kind of hopefully provide some slides to help entertain you frame this issue more broadly. So I am with Sheer Energy, as Marik did a great job of teaming up. We are the first company to have received a license, a non-FTA license, as well as a full permits, slate of permits from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Up until a few weeks ago, we're the only project to have received our full slate of permits. Cameron, December's project in Cameron LNG. A few weeks ago, we received a permit, and just yesterday, FERC gave Dominion a license for their Cove Point facility. So we've been under construction at our facility. Yeah, please don't invest in anything I'm about to tell you. We've been under construction at our facility since mid-2012, and this provides you an overview of how this project is progressing. We believe this is, if not the largest, it's certainly one of the largest capital-intensive projects in the way from the United States. We're looking at about a $12 billion project here for the first 4 trains in Sabine Pass. Currently, we have about 4,000 people every day coming to our facility. This is one of the most important job programs in the country right now. And you can see the relative scale of this project. You can see the background existing tanks at our Sabine Pass facility. You see trains 1 and 2 under construction here. There's a second picture just to tee it up. I've lost my mic. Sorry. Sorry. Questions on Jeff? I apologize. You can see the relative scale, though. This is an incredible project. We're paying about $2 billion in wages for the life of this project, which is going to take about 6 years to complete. This is less than Thanks. We're spending approximately $3 billion on U.S. source manufactured equipment. So this is just, you can see the relative scale. It's an incredible project. I don't think you can probably make out people here. I had to blow this picture up about 250% times its normal size to find people in this picture, but obviously there's a lot of people here at work building the project right now. So that being said, I want to describe or frame, since we're here talking about international security and energy security, I want to frame this issue how we at Cheniere see the market. We've been involved with the market, as Marik said, for well over a decade. It originally is looking to import natural gas, and now, of course, we turned the facility around and are looking to export. But we've been engaged with the international market over the course of this time. So I want to provide a slide, hopefully to give you sort of at a macro level, frame the issue of not only LNG, but the international gas market. And there's a fairly dense slide here. There's a lot going on, but what you see here is a relative scale of the regional markets, which is the left column, the lighter blue. You see the proportion of the markets that is served by LNG, which is the right, darker blue column. And you also see price formation in the various regions. Now, it's important to put this in perspective. The global market, which you can kind of see up top, the global market is about 325 BCF a day of natural gas consumption. LNG constitutes about 10% of that market, about 31 BCF a day as of last year. So the balance of that, the other 90%, is pipeline deliveries. Such as, for example, here in the United States, we predominantly receive our natural gas via pipeline. We have resources all over the country. We have outstanding midstream infrastructure. And for most places around the world, this is the preferred way of receiving gas is by pipeline. Not every market has those qualities of it. Some markets lack resources. The resources are far away from the population centers. Perhaps the resources are in your neighbor's backyard, and you don't know your neighbors so well. Various issues, but predominantly LNG, you can see most natural gas is delivered by pipeline. Now, a few comments to make. I want to focus a few observations here on Asia. As you can see, Asia is by far the largest LNG market, as well as the market that's most dependent upon LNG to meet their natural gas needs. LNG constitutes about 40%, over 40% of the Asian market, and of LNG deliveries, about 75% of LNG is currently going to Asia. By contrast, you can see the North American market is the least dependent upon LNG. The other thing, of course, that stands out is the relative size of the North American market. We're at nearly 90 BCF a day, US, Canada, Mexico. You can see that's about double the size of the European market. Now, this scale is important because when you see a lot of the critics of exports will discuss this engaging with the international market in rather ominous tones and sort of depicted this yawning vortex that's poised to suck all the gas out of our country. And what you can see here is that's really not the case. In fact, the US, we're the largest gas producing country in the world. We're on track to produce about 70 BCF per day by the end of this year. That is more than twice the size of the global LNG market. Okay? So as we engage with this market, it's important to put these things in perspective. The relative size matters. For example, this year we're in the US in about a $4 price environment. We're poised to grow production around about 4 BCF per day. 4 BCF per day in the LNG world is unprecedented breakneck speed growth. We're talking about 12% growth on our current base. And of course, we're not the only participant in the market, some other participants as well. So really, the US is sort of the sleeping giant in this market as we're poised to engage. And the other factor beyond just our size, of course, is price formation. And Marik did an outstanding job of sort of teeing this issue up. But you can see that the US, we're rather unique in the sense that we have this very well-developed market where gas-on-gas competition transpires, meaning that the supply and demand fundamentals of particular to natural gas are what determines the clearing price in the market in both daily spot futures on out.
That's really the exception to the world. In Asia, you can see Asia and Europe predominantly, certainly in Asia, it's an oil index market. LNG's always been for over 40 years an oil index commodity until we and others in the US have offered an alternative. In Europe, it's a little more dynamic and complicated situation. You have oil index LNG competing against pipeline supplies, and competition is good. Problem being, as Marik said, a lot of those pipeline supplies are themselves oil index, so you don't really get optimal competition under those circumstances. Europe is transitioning to a hub-based system. The jury's, I think the verdict's still out there how much this is going to ultimately determine these foundational prices within the market. Of course, the other issue in Europe, as Marik said, was the fact that Russia is behind so many of these pipeline supplies. Russia accounts for about 30% of the European market. So not only are we, when we participate in this market, not only are we participating as a large player, as the largest player, in fact, in the world, but we're offering a fundamentally new model, a different alternative to buyers in the world about how to price natural gas. And so we're more than just another participant. In fact, we're offering sort of a new paradigm, which gives a lot of leverage to buyers that they've never had in over 40 years in this industry. So I want to now just focus upon the LNG aspect of this. This LNG industry started, I think the first LNG shipment came out in 1959 from Louisiana to the UK. So kind of coming full circle here a bit. You can see the relative size of the market. This is about 25 years ago, about the midpoint of the market. You can see that it's predominantly a regionalized market at this point. You have Asia, you have Europe. Japan, of course, is the largest and continues to be the largest consumer of LNG, but it's very much a regionalized system. Now, fast forward to how the market looked last year, and you can see that we're moving towards a more globalized type market. You can also see that we've had more diversity, both on the supply and on the consumption side. Markets have moved into South America. We're even importing LNG into the Middle East of all places, and Kuwait, and in a few years, most likely Dubai will join in as well. And so a couple of things do stand out. You can see that it's becoming, again, it's becoming more of a global business. The diversity, we have 29 LNG importing countries, 17 suppliers. It's important to stress this is an ongoing process. When you look 3, 5, 10 years out, there's more and more countries that will be joining in, many of which will be receiving natural gas for the first time in those markets. In the 2 years, for example, talking about Europe, we'll likely to have Lithuania and Poland join in as LNG importing nations. And so this is an ongoing process, but there's still a lot of optimization needed. And of course, the underpinnings of a lot of this is still primarily an oil index commodity that has some rather stiff and inflexible trading restrictions. For example, you have destination restrictions where ships can go. You have these take-or-pay contracts that are a bit inflexible in the market. And so we're offering, or we're hoping to provide more flexibility in the market than is seen in the U.S. broadly. Chenier, as well as other projects we expect from the U.S., will accelerate this process of providing more liquidity and a more dynamic market. So finally, this is my last slide. I just want to give an outlook for LNG demand growth. To frame this issue, this is a look at what Wood Mackenzie is estimating for demand growth for the next 10 years. So they're talking about nearly 6% growth. And to frame that, the many forecasters, the EIA, the IEA, are broadly in agreement that natural gas is going to be the fastest growing global hydrocarbon fuel for the next 25 years, growing at about a 2%, a little less than a 2% rate. So what you're seeing here is that LNG, as a subset of natural gas, is growing about 3 times the underlying rate globally. The drivers are, of course, as we broadly discussed before, it's industrialization occurring in a lot of the developing world. This is predominantly non-OECD growth, and it's also environmental pressures. I mean, as we've seen here at home, domestically, natural gas has across the slate is environmentally preferred compared to coal, and so it's a lot of demand, a lot of growth, predominantly in Asia. You can see the tail end of the curve. It's going to be a lot of, also European demand is going to be growing. A lot of that is an issue of their, not so much economic growth, but of broader import dependence on natural gas and the expectation that LNG would take some of that market. So we see a vibrant market. This is really where a lot of the action is in the industry, and we see a broad role for the United States to play in this market. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And
Jennifer, how do you see the geopolitical implications of natural gas, and maybe also comment on how the administration has viewed natural gas, even in light of your past experience working with the State Department on geoeconomic issues and energy security?
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for picking up on a Tuesday morning to come hear us. I would like to kind of break this down into 2.5 parts. First, to your direct question, sort of what are the geopolitical stakes? I'll just lay out a few of the broad strokes that tend to be the sort of reoccurring questions that I certainly experienced over the 10-ish years that I was covering this in the U.S. government, first for the intelligence world and then for the State Department. Second, I do want to touch a little bit on the sort of macroeconomic consequences because I have a long-running project to build in, price in the kind of economic underpinnings of the U.S. Decision-making calculus that too often sort of just coded as a narrow geopolitical question. And then finally, if there are kind of geopolitical benefits to be had, how do we capitalize? We lay out a few of the decisions that, frankly, were mostly imperfect decisions that we were wrestling with. My now former colleagues probably still are. So what are the geopolitical stakes here? First, I think, as you all I'm sure have read plenty in the press over the last 8 or 10 months, there seems to be an overriding question of, is this a weapon? Is this something that certainly it feels like a weapon in the pipeline politics that we see prosecuted against parts of Europe from Russia. But is it certainly, if not a weapon, then a point of leverage for the U.S. and in ways that we might be able to lessen the vulnerabilities of Europe on? And here, I think it's important to unpack the sort of like common refrain of this question, which is, can't we sell them more gas? Well, it's not clear who the we is in that, nor the them, because it's certainly not any sort of magic liver that I had at the State Department. These are markets, these are decisions more for my colleague here to my left than for anyone in the U.S. government, probably as they well should be. And so, it's not clear that even if a lot of these regulatory issues were sort of swept away tomorrow, that it would redound to the kind of automatic building of more infrastructure to get more gas sort of out of the ground and to our European friends tomorrow. And part of that is a kind of global price, or sort of a European price issue, I should say. Right now, American LNG is not competitive with Russian LNG, and it's not as if we can ask the reserve part of the Q&A for it, but my understanding is that American LNG firms are not eager to kind of sell at a loss for some sort of profiles and courage badge. So until that's the case, I do think that it's going to be a bank shot. It's going to be about lowering the kind of patchwork global price, mainly through selling to Asia. That's not to say that we haven't already seen some benefits on the kind of global price through the U.S. LNG boom. That there's a counterfactual to be mined here. What would the price be right now if more of American LNG demand were not kind of immediately stated by the production that we're witnessing here at home? There's not much to be done here in terms of putting together an immediate security solution for Europe. I think there actually may be a little bit more. I'm usually in a minority in this, and I know this is not a conversation about gas or oil, but I think there is a little bit more to be said for looking to oil in the U.S. boom as part of the geopolitical co-benefit when it comes to putting pressure on some unfriendly actors in the world stage. And right now, I believe Russia's break-even price for oil is around $110 a barrel, and a lot of that, frankly, has been bid up by the sort of adventurism of the Russian government in using Gazprom as its sort of personal kitty, from funding the Olympics to funding friends and enemies alike, to APEC. Gazprom is usually prominently featured as a corporate sponsor, basically, anything that pops into Mr. Putin's head. And so long as that's the case, I think you're going to see a very narrow margin for error in terms of Russia's break-even price. So to the extent that there are supplies coming online from the U.S., I think Russia is probably the most vulnerable there. Again, that's on the other side. And there's something to be said for not just the kind of aggregate supply that's coming on in the U.S. and how this changes the geopolitical picture, but the way in which this rearranges the deck chair, so to speak, of the changing trade patterns. The U.S. sort of traditional import dependence is rightly seen as mostly, a point of vulnerability politically for the United States. But there's something to be said for a large appetite in geopolitical terms. And as you see certain plays being backed out, in terms of things that used to be coming to the U.S., Western Africa, and part of the Middle East, I think it's, the politics are likely to kind of follow the commerce there, and to the extent that they are picking up new customers, largely in Asia, largely in China, it's only understandable and natural that there would be a greater desire to accommodate the politics of those countries. So just a space to watch. This tends to get wrapped up in questions of whether or not the U.S. is sort of going to pull its fleet out of various gulfs in the Middle East. I think that's hyperbolic, but I do think that it will be interesting. It's not like a non-alloyed good necessarily in terms of how the geopolitics of some of these changing trade patterns play out for the U.S. I think one of the largest benefits to the U.S. of the gas will become clear when we do look at the counterfactual with Ukraine. We had a lot of freedom of action, I think, to assess the situation as it was sort of escalating over the last 10 months between Moscow and Kiev, and you did see largely for a long time. I think that's happily changing now. I think that the U.S. was sort of out in front, sort of leading Europe for what was largely a European security problem for history. And I think that was in large part because we had less on the line in terms of our energy needs. And back when the U.S. wasn't producing as much of its own gas, we were more dependent on the global price, to the extent that there is one, more certainly vulnerable to supply shocks. It's not clear to me that we would have been able to be so assertive. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. Certainly happy to discuss that. But there is a certain maneuverability that this sort of supply abundance of LNG domestically has brought us, which I think can only be to the good. So that's kind of the positive analysis. Just one beat on the kind of economic consequences of all of this, and sort of then turn to kind of the how do we capitalize. Similar to the geopolitical picture, the economic consequences are threshold positive, but there are some interesting kind of question marks that we should think through as a country, and I'll be interested to sort of see how our political system manages that. But it's often sort of noted that one of the biggest places you're going to see a benefit is to our current account. And That's true, but as that happens, I do think that there could be pressure on the dollar, especially to the extent that we start exporting this stuff in large quantities. And I think the stronger the U.S. currency gets, the more difficult it certainly makes to sell other widgets. I'm not entirely myself sure about how long some of these employment pictures and the sort of the jobs that are associated with some of these projects are going to last, whether these are construction jobs that sort of end with the construction of the facilities or whether they stick around for longer than that. I think that question's a bit up for the shaping, and it would be nice to kind of do what we can to transition these into longer term jobs, sort of use them as platforms to begin retraining some of the skill bases for certain parts of the country that kind of need to be retrained anyway. I'm not sure we're kind of that fashion forward in how we're approaching that right now. So, and then kind of what do we do about it question. I guess I'm going to sort of just sketch out two broad areas of inquiry. One is the sort of how do we export this and to whom? The debate that I was privy to in the U.S. government was mostly around, do we put this in a trade agreement? And there, the problem, certainly if we got in front of putting it in a trade agreement sort of by doing something in the next 6 to 10 months as we're negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership to largely vis-a-vis East Asian countries, although there are Peru and some others that are Latin America, and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership with Europe. A large part of what's drawing these countries to the negotiating table has to do with access to energy, and those negotiations are a bit hard. They don't seem to be getting any easier, and so I think there is some valid concern that pulling one of the biggest draws for these countries out of the agreement and sort of, I don't want to say giving it away for free, but giving it away sooner than the rest of the agreement would undermine the U.S.'s sort of current efforts in both of those negotiations. And then, there's also kind of a lot of grand talk about selling it to our friends, essentially. We hear a lot about sort of liberalizing these exports to India alongside getting it done in TPP and TTIP. And once you kind of start to add up the math geographically, it kind of starts to look like an anybody but China strategy. And for reasons that I think the panel's already laid out pretty well, there's some hypocrisy in that to the extent we are concerned about the kind of opt-out approach that China has taken for securing its energy needs already by sort of going on a large going out campaign and doing this through bilateral deals largely financed by the state rather than kind of playing within the established global market rules and relying on the open market. I don't think that sort of helps our arguments there. And so the last question that I think is perhaps the most important, but least asked, is are we really, in terms of how we capitalize on the geopolitical opportunities of the LNG boom, are we really walking the talk and using this as a bridge fuel? It's billed that way. We're justifying these exports in large part because this gas is cleaner than coal. It's not clear to me that we are really having this debate in a way that hastens the day when we are at a substantially renewables grid. And I think that there are different policy choices that we can make now that we need to build into even the export question that would do better service to those goals. Things like if we are going to export the technology to certain countries, which I think they're almost more interested in than the actual gas, could we do so with renewable energy standards as a quid pro quo. I don't know. It would certainly be easier to do that sort of thing if we had those sort of stronger commitments here at home. And I'm not sure we're doing enough to kind of make it safe. I anecdotally grew up in Oklahoma, and there is a wildcatter issue. I'm not into the sort of engineering of this, but I'm told that containing methane is not hard, and in some ways, the environmental groups that are putting so much attention on that issue, while it is an important issue and we get it right, almost shortchanging some of these larger questions about are we really rightfully using this as a bridge fuel towards something even cleaner. And I think there's plenty of money to be made. I think we can be adults and just get it right, just sort of get the regulation there that needs to be there, and probably do ourselves greater service by avoiding accidents that could cause for reflexive sort of knee-jerk over-regulations down the road.
Hey, thanks Jennifer, and thanks for all of those really insightful comments by all of you. Jennifer made an interesting point, which I'd like to turn to a question to Andrew and maybe Chris as well. The question of will U.S. gas ever reach Europe? So of course, Asian spot prices are about 50% higher than in Europe, but a lot of the impetus for legislative action has been really prompted by the Ukraine crisis and the vulnerability of Ukraine and other NATO allies in the Baltics and Poland. Lithuania and Poland are in the midst of building LNG terminals. From what I can tell, at least in the Polish case, they're talking to a lot of Qatari suppliers. Do you think U.S. gas will make it to Europe? And regardless of how you answer that, how would it affect European energy security more broadly?
Sure. Great question.
Jay brought up an excellent issue of where is the gas going, and if you look, as Marik said, if you look at the Asian prices, they're certainly higher. What we're offering the market is flexibility in contracts. So everything's with the caveat that we don't really know where it's going to be going when we start exporting. Our first exports, hopefully by year in 2015. It's ultimately the customers. That being said, I'd like to point out we do have, in our case, speaking for Cheniere, about 2/3 of our contracted capacity is actually to European-based companies. We'll run through a short list: Centrica, Iberdrola, Gas Natural, DG, Enel Endesa, EDF. It's a long list. Now, some of these are marketing type companies, but many of them are utilities. They have actual customers with actual gas needs. I think this issue of where the LNG is going to be going, a lot of it's framed in this. People look at the Asian price and they say, "Oh, the price is high, that's where it's going to go." I think you need to take a more nuanced view of the market. Some players are going to be what you would call, so they're global in scale, that you call portfolio players. These are marketers. This sort of fits the description of this scenario where they're looking ultimately to resell the gas to the highest price market. And certainly, if you look at prices, Asia is typically where they're not always. In fact, recently, summer, South America was at the highest LNG prices in the world. And so this sort of fits this paradigm of it'll go to the price will go to the highest market, the LNG will go to the highest price market. That only fits certain players in the market. There are others, some of which I just mentioned that we've contracted with, that they're not looking to resell their gas. They're not looking to flip it. They want the LNG because they need it. They're utilities, they're LECs, they're power generators, and their interest in U.S.-based LNG is, again, not because they want to resell it, because they have actual customers with actual gas needs. I think for these type of players, if we are successful in locking down, whether it be Cheniere or another U.S.-based player, you're actually going to make a rather direct and enduring impact on their energy security profile. So that being said, we're going to have to see where the market, where the LNG goes. In our case, we know, for example, that one of our this is public. One of our customers, in fact, Gas Natural, has already resold some of their LNG to South America. If you look at shipping distance, we see that as being a very natural market, as well, of course, as Europe. And but ultimately, what's important, and this the other issue is just ultimately adding more liquidity to the market. It might be the case, for example, as you said, that the Qataris or some other supplier ends up signing a contract with one here in Poland. It may not be a U.S.-based company. However, it might be the competition the U.S. provides in the market that takes away another customer from those suppliers that ultimately lays the groundwork for them to make these deals with a European-based entity. So it's the important issue of the U.S. to provide liquidity in the market. If we can lock in on customers such as these Eastern European type utilities, that'd be great. But regardless, by adding more liquidity to the market, you increase the probability that it will be successful in securing these projects. These projects take 5-10 years in scale to build, to commercialize, to permit, and ultimately to find a supplier. It's a long-term process, and the more that we can do to increase the probability of success for our friends and allies, that's how we're going to be enduring impact.
The only thing I would add on top of that is it's not just the liquidity of the actual supply of the commodity too. It's bringing in the additional competitive factor of prices based off of Henry Hub or some function thereof, which Jennifer went into significantly about the traditionally crude type prices. Although that's a double-edged sword too. I mean, we're starting to see, especially in Asia, as the price of Brent falls, somewhat unexpectedly, it's making traditional LNG pricing more competitive than it was before. And a lot of companies, I think we're starting to see hedge against that continuing. I think there's less people who believe that is a long-term effect than not, but any global trader, whether they're an end user or whether they're a trading house, is going to want to hedge against that. But bringing that new competitive factor of prices tied to Henry Hub in one way, shape, or form adds an additional function on top of liquidity that ultimately permeates throughout the world as we start to make this more of a competitive market as opposed to an arbitrary algorithmic price tied to crude oil.
And how do you respond to the argument raised by many opponents about the manufacturing renaissance that's taking place in the United States? I was in Germany recently and heard that even despite Germany's own manufacturing prowess, a lot of German companies are moving to the United States to set up their offshore manufacturing facilities due almost exclusively to low energy prices. How do you think, and I know that argument plays on the Hill. In fact, a lot of opponents of legislation that would change the LNG export regime specifically cite this sort of manufacturing renaissance. What is your response to that?
If I may first, the renaissance is beyond real. We're looking at $120 billion invested between now and 2020 just in the petrochemical sector alone to take advantage of the low feedstock price. Added on top of already competitive, if not significantly cheaper electricity rates and more stable electricity rates, primarily because of the competitive nature of gas in the wholesale and retail electricity market. But if you look at this as a sort of series of dominoes, I mean, that $120 billion is based off of the fact that we can produce a ton of ethylene, which is arguably the most core component to the petrochemical product line, and ultimately to the traditional manufacturers, your sort of Acme Inc., who makes widgets somewhere in the middle of Ohio. We can produce that ton of ethylene for $300. If you move to Asia and to Europe, it costs them upwards of $900 to produce that same ton, because they're deriving the same molecules out of naphtha, which is a refinery byproduct, so from crude oil, whereas we're using the raw ethane coming out of the ground. So you add on top of that the electricity rates that are half of what they are in Germany, the EU's leading manufacturer. You can see why the depth of manufacturing in this country was vastly overstated 10 years ago. To get to the point about how exports play into that, the part that I rarely hear anyone address is, okay, we're talking about methane, we're talking about dry gas, that's what LNG is. But from the manufacturing standpoint, they rely much more so on the liquids. Liquids are a completely different commodity, and there's a myriad of liquids on top of that. The more that we pull the methane out of the ground, the more that as the price goes up, because the demand goes up, because we start exporting it, that may very well send price signals, likely to send price signals, to some of those shut-in wells or yet to be completed wells that I talked about in my opening remarks in Pennsylvania and in Texas and Arkansas, to start pulling that out of the ground. One of the inherent byproducts of pulling that out of the ground is more liquid gas, more butane, more methane, more ethane, propane, the things that these manufacturers utilize. So there is an perhaps unintended benefit to these same manufacturers, which are already realizing a huge benefit in these markets because those markets are glutted as well. So you're adding oversupply on top of glut, which pushes the price of their core feedstocks down even further. Ultimately, we've seen 3 studies now, both within the government and outside of the government, that say the net benefit to the economy is positive. That's all fine and good, but if you lose your job because if you're one of the minority who loses your job, or more importantly, if you're a company who doesn't benefit, you don't really necessarily care about the broader context because it's hurting your bottom line. But it's very difficult to see in any one particular case where the manufacturing sector is not going to benefit, certainly across the board, and even this very specialized area of manufacturing, petrochemicals, because of the additional supply of liquids that are coming to the market.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Chris made an excellent point about the liquids. It's called ethylene for a reason. Its base feedstock is ethane, not natural gas. And so as we export more, we're going to increase the supply of ethane and other liquids in the market, which actually is going to be a benefit to the petrochemical industry. If you actually look, for example, at the Canadian situation, their petrochemical industry is very supportive of their efforts to export gas because they understand this issue. They need the liquid feedstock to help them create these products. And the other point to be here, I think, is first put in perspective. Since middle of the last decade, since this sort of unconditional energy boom has started, we've been growing our production in the United States at more than twice the rate as our demand. We have had healthy demand growth. It's just that we've gotten so good at producing it, we're outpacing that. And the EI expects that to continue for the next 25 years. They're expecting double production growth rate and double that of consumption. So it's not an either-or situation, it's both. And the other issue comes to competitiveness. Even if you're not a petrochemical company, in our case, will be the relative global competitive nature of the cost structure here is going to keep the U.S. competitive no matter what. I mean, we're looking at a $4 price right now. Our customers are going to pay $3 to liquefy at our facility. They're going to pay another, say, $3 to take it to Asia. And they got to pay regasification fees, pipeline distribution fees. So you're looking at about 3 times the price by the time it gets to this end market versus what a U.S.-based company would be paying here. So embedded within this structure, the U.S. industries will always maintain its competitive edge.
And Jennifer, you mentioned some of the trade debates taking place in the administration with respect to TPP and TTIP. I know a lot of European allies are particularly pushing for energy to be included in TTIP. How does the United States, as a matter of economic diplomacy, where we go out and talk to all sorts of countries about important principles about non-discrimination and treating all partners on a fair basis, how do we bring the energy export regime in line with a lot of these principles that we advocate around the world as sort of a core tenet of our economic policy?
I actually just edited a paper on the Member Ware's crisis that wasn't essentially in 2010 with the Chinese embargo. And so I feel like I'm very steeped in the details of that right now. I want to do some more thinking actually about whether there are distinctions to be had between the sorts of arguments that the U.S. made in the WTO on the rare earths issue, and how we treat gas and oil for export. My guess is that there are enough steam valves built into the WTO for politics and for geopolitics that I'm less persuaded by the sort of double standards issues, if only because of the sort of massive precedent that we've had. Even if it wasn't sort of correct to do it like we've done it for the 60 years that the WTO's been around, precedent matters, especially in trade law. And there are like national security exceptions that are built into the WTO that have sort of never been exercised. We sort of expected Russia might go there, and now that they are a WTO member. And a lot of the more curious trade bans that they've put on some of their neighbors, including Ukraine, and chocolates, because today they're carcinogenic apparently, when tomorrow yesterday they weren't. Those sorts of things. But yet Russia hasn't pulled that trigger because I think they understand that it would be a very slippery slope. And I think it's almost the better question is not how do we bring energy into a pretty broken trade framework, but how do we fix the trade framework so that it allows for quicker redress of legitimate grievances, like a lot of the stuff we've seen coming out of Russia and the sort of pipeline politics that they've been waging. I mean, in some ways, if no one has really been able to bring a suit in a timely way against Russia for the egregious pipeline politics that they've been playing, even just in the last 12 months, I think that's probably a more pressing question than whether or not the U.S. is at a double standard or at risk of sort of hypocrisy in our current LNG.
And
Going back to my point about how LNG is really the undercard, I don't necessarily disagree with your point that it may be viewed, it doesn't matter how we got to where we are, ultimately we got it right, because LNG is such a smaller node. I mean, we're already seeing signals that the window is closing on the ability to export gas. And we're not here for recriminations about whether or not we went fast enough or not. But the point is once we start glutting light sweet crude, then the metrics change completely, because you're talking about a globalized commodity. You're talking about a WTI price that will continually decrease in competitive comparison. And you're going to see countries, not the least of which Canada, God bless them, arbitraging off of our violations of our own commitments to the WTO. And I think that will exacerbate whatever outcome it is, whether it's trying to fix the WTO or whether it's trying to bring our policies in compliance with it. But that is a much bigger scale because, again, once crude gluts here, the impacts will be significantly more widely felt across the country and potentially across the world when they see that they can be purchasing crude at a steep discount to what Brent crude is than what LNG is providing right now.
well, before I open it up to questions from the audience, I'll just offer one other sort of intermediate position that a lot of people have been advocating with respect to LNG exports, with the ideal being amendment to the Natural Gas Act to bring the United States legally into compliance with WTO commitments. The administration has it within its authority to expedite its review of licenses and approvals. I know a number of licenses have taken several years. I don't know how long Cheniere's took, but they have been going quicker, but with dozens of licenses languishing for multiple years doesn't seem like the most effective way to approach the issue. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Host's prerogative here to ask the first question from the audience. So I wanted to unpack something that Andrew said here that I think is very important that gets overlooked in the debate, especially on the Hill. you said it's $3 to $4 price, $3 shipping, $3 for regasification. So basically, you're tripling the price delivered when you send it. So there's a built-in kind of inherent advantage for U.S. producers, U.S. consumers of it. So there's always going to be this built-in benefit for U.S. consumers. So I think that's an important thing. And it kind of is a different thing, makes this a different debate than the debate about crude. Because the chemical nature of gas is that it's always going to be expensive to move it. So I think that's important to look at and remember. But it also kind of means that the benefits of the shale gas revolution don't come just from exporting it, but also from exporting the technology. Getting to a real global market really is exporting U.S. technology as well as exporting U.S. gas. So I wonder if each of you might have some thoughts on, Chris, what your members doing to help try and invest in places like China or Asia or Eastern Europe, or Jennifer, what's State done, and is Cheniere looking for as well?
Obviously, U.S. shale reserves are small in comparison to China. You look at what is being done in China right now, I mean, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars spent in the last 2 years. South America is probably the even bigger market right now. But ultimately, the part that generally gets, I think, overlooked in the discussion about the exportation of this technology and this revolution is the fact that the United States is so unique in being the one country that I'm aware of, and I've yet to have anyone tell me otherwise, where landowners own the mineral rights. I mean, we're seeing, even in countries, whether it be Poland or whether it be UK or even Australia, we're seeing countries that are trying to aggressively develop their shale reserves, China as well. But you just run into issues. I mean, even at the end of the day, if you want to do what's right for God and country and queen or whatever the case is, you really want to have to deal with a 6-week drilling period of lights 24 hours a day, and lots of noise and lots of traffic, and maybe they knock your fence over and your cattle get out. When you're not given, believe me, this happens a dozen times a day in this country. When you're not given the least bit of economic incentive, it just changes the parameters so significantly. And it's led, I think, to some of the issues we've seen in places like Poland, where you had a concerted effort to try and develop it, but you didn't have the same sort of democracy or democratic way of spreading the wealth. I mean, I think what the UK is doing right now of trying to find a way to share the royalties with the landowner maybe is a way around it. I don't know if they ultimately get there, but the bottom line is I think that, unfortunately, our own form of democracy here and power to the people will give us a competitive advantage going well into the future, because it's going to be so much more difficult to develop the reserves in the world than it happened here. So ultimately, both exporting at a tremendous markup as well as the inability to really export the technology is an unfortunate, in some way, in some cases, boon for the U.S., both the producers and the consumers.
Sure. As I said earlier, I think we should look at this area in particular as one area to make a real down payment on our rhetoric when using LNG as a bridge fuel to renewables and to getting the environmental issues right. We attach minimum standards of prudence around a lot of other sensitive areas of export, defense and dual use to other countries. I don't see that it's much different. And in order to do that in the most possible sort of effective way, I think that we ourselves should back again to the regulatory issues around that in country and then the health.
Yeah, just brief comments. So to following what Christopher was saying, and everything he said was correct. It's a matter. I mean, the other issue, aside from political will, is the underground risk. For the countries who have the political will or are moving forward with trying to develop shale gas, for example, Poland, China as examples. There's geologic issues as well. We're finding that a lot of these basins are more faulted than we find in the U.S. If you look at these pictures of the U.S. and the shale basins, a lot of them are like sort of pancaking effect of this level, thick layer of shale. In a lot of cases, so far, that isn't always the case. It's more difficult to produce whenever you have more of a faulted type basin. The other issue that's important, besides of course the mineral rights, which Chris was right on, is it's important to remember that with the U.S., when this is technology driven, and when producers cracked the code, they had the benefit of about 100+ years of core logs they could look at. We've been drilling for decades. And so they could go back and look and identify, okay, now we know how to unlock shale gas where are the shales, and that gives us a huge advantage where you don't have, that other countries don't have. I mean, they're starting from scratch more or less in terms of trying to identify. So it's going to take some time.
Any other questions?
Morning, my name is Pete Kelly, and I have a question about water with relation to fracking, and I guess this issue came to my mind when the State Department was trying to promote fracking to Jordan, which has got to be one of the driest countries in the world, so I find that remarkable. But anyway, we were speaking about China, and China certainly has water issues. So any general comments on that, but especially for Andrew, is there a possibility to use brackish water, saline water, instead of fresh water to do this, so you're not using, a freshwater resource?
Well, I mean, preface by saying I'm not an expert. I mean, we don't drill directly, so it's what I would pick up be secondhand. There's a lot of work by the industry to make this as clean as possible, to move beyond using water. You're seeing, for example, the use of or experimentation with like using propane as a fracking mechanism. I mean, I think this is early days in that your issue with brackish water, there is a lot of recycling going on. For example, in the Marcellus, it's overwhelmingly recycled. There's the amount of water that's being used and reused. So it's something where I think the industry is aware that there's public concern on this issue, and in the same way that we more or less engineered this ability to create gas where the gas previously wasn't accessible, they're looking to apply the same technology-based solutions to address public concerns.
The rate of innovation is phenomenal. If you go to West Texas, which I have the privilege of being in 3 times in the last 6 weeks, just the overall price of water forces producers to have no choice but to innovate around ways of using more of it, whether it's recycling it even more than they already do. I mean, I think it's clear in any formation that is not sort of 3 weeks old, you're talking about completely closed loop systems, which means you generally start with recycled water, groundwater, and then it stays in the loop until it gets to a point of salt saturation, where it just starts literally gumming up the pipes. And then they'll go and they'll treat that, and they'll start over again with groundwater. But the price of water forces that issue. And we're seeing the early stages of some pretty phenomenal innovation. I've seen several companies who literally started off in the business of bringing potable water to the developing world in places like South America, Central America, and Africa, using technologies, semi-permeable membranes that are all dispatchable, or they're all powered by solar. So you can put it out in the middle of nowhere and give a village of 200 people, clean water. Well, hey, why can't we apply this to the stuff that we're pulling out of the hole? And they're starting to do that. I mean, we've seen, won't talk about specific companies, but we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars invested in Pennsylvania and Texas to try and apply the same exact technology, which now has got about 8 companies trying to convey it, to actual drill sites. And we're seeing tremendous benefits, because at the end of the day, you end up with pure water, good enough to, better to drink than most municipal water, certainly around the world. And then you get the rest of the minerals precipitated out that can be recycled back into all kinds of things. So ironically, perhaps, in this case, the market, especially in West Texas, where water is at such a high price, has forced companies to be able to utilize less and less of it. And we're seeing things like Andrew said, I mean, bringing some of the other liquids in that are already blended. Things like ethane, I mean, in some ways, it's being rejected on the ethane market, and it's being sold off as natural gas, which at the end of the day, it can be utilized that way. But the point is that the molecules aren't valuable enough. So hey, why not take that same stuff and use it as a possible fluid? So the drilling service companies are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in this every year. They are not very good at sharing these details with the public because frankly they're trying to create a competitive advantage for themselves. But the rate of innovation is exponential.
Other questions?
Thank you. I'm from Norway, and my question is more addressing the climate impact as well as consumer. For LNG, today steady growth demand. Have you considered to invest also in a better use of LNG to get more valuable chemicals from LNG? To take issue, I selected some of the technologies to prove to what extent it's realistic it is. The second question is climate impact. In Europe, the awareness is very strong, both indoor climate and outdoor. Indoor, France evaluated this year the impact of indoor, bad quality indoor climate in France. It's over $19 billion euro per year. So my question is, to what extent, having such an opportunity for America, why not to look at consumer level, impact level, or in particular climate type of impact? Make sense? I hope.
So clearly in the U.S., we've seen whenever there's been environmental regulation, you see broadly the market gravitating towards natural gas. We've seen here in the U.S., of course, this huge issue, this broad level of switching from coal, away from coal to natural gas. And we know that the emissions at the point of combustion, that natural gas is about 8% less greenhouse gases than coal, as well as a whole host of other things, such as particulates, mercury that are not in natural gas. So I think the issue for the climate, I think when you look at market growth, there's two things to consider. One is what if we don't export U.S. natural gas, what will the customer use instead? And in many cases that will be, in some cases it will not be natural gas. For example, you have, in many places you have utilities that are looking to make 20-year decisions around the world, developing nations. Do I build a coal plant to meet my load growth, or can I find a secure and affordable supply of natural gas instead? The other issue is, for other customers, if it's not U.S.-based natural gas, the question is, well, it might be somebody else's natural gas. The question that we need to ask is, we have this incredible debate here in the U.S. about climate impacts. We see the arc of where we're trending is that we're getting better. Jim brought up the issue of methane emissions. We're expecting EPA regulations coming online in the next 2 years. We see, of course, the president's a new long-term climate initiative for the EPA. The question you have to ask is, is Russia on the same trajectory? Is Nigeria on the same trajectory? And I'm not an expert in these matters, but you can imagine the answer. I suspect the answer is no. So the DOE did look at the climate issue. I mean, they put out their recent rulemaking over the summer. They put out probably the first comprehensive analysis of climate impacts of LNG from the U.S. And broadly, they found over a 100-year cycle, there's a wide range of assumptions there, depending upon whether you're knocking out a coal plant in China or a coal plant in Europe, or if you're knocking out Russian gas.
So there's a wide range of uncertainty. There needs to be more scholarship probably in this matter. But what they found in most cases was over a 100-year cycle that U.S. LNG was going to have around 25 to 60% improvement over some other source. So again, it's a lot of uncertainty there. There needs to be more work on this, but certainly the results so far are encouraging.
I don't think I find it difficult to hear arguments that are serious on the environmental score that aren't in favor of doubling down on LNG. It's a matter of doing it right, and we are not finished in that effort. And the EPA regulations that I think we all hope are coming down the line, it's not going to be self-executing. And there's going to be a lot of money spent in this town around what those look like. And I think it's important to get a vigorous sort of public debate with all sides engaged on that. And as to the sort of substitution thing, I think that's exactly right. I think it's important to, there's an educational campaign yet to be fully waged in this country around the perception gap between the degree of perceived dependence in certain parts of the country on coal and the actual state of that dependence. If you look at the polling around West Virginia, how much people believe their livelihoods to be attached to coal versus the actual facts on the ground, it's kind of stunning. So there's educational diplomacy to be done there, and it's not just the job of the State Department or the U.S. government. I think our friends in the natural gas industry sort of have some stake in that as well, and to the extent, again, that there is a war being waged on coal, it's coming from natural gas, not the EPA.
I'll completely reject that last remark. Well, it's absolutely true that the price of that methane gutting and the decreased price for methane has put downward price pressure on coal. The competition from gas is not going to be what is closing 20% of the coal plants in 2016. It's accelerated mercury standards to remove the final 5% of mercury. We've already removed 95% of it, but for reasons that aren't completely clear, at least to me, instead of giving an extended time for that final 5%, we're giving less time. The point is we'll see a significant dislocation. So I mean, there is a real function there. But from a global standpoint, going back to your original question, I think it's important to realize that while natural gas demand is growing faster than any other hydrocarbon, coal is still growing very, very quickly. And according to both EIA and IEA, at some point, maybe it's today, maybe it's the next year, maybe it's in 2 years, coal will supersede oil as the single largest fuel source around the world. And at the end of the day, unlike these other air pollutants, things like mercury, particulate matter, NOx, SOx, that actually have epidemiological effects on human beings, negative ones, CO2 has none. So we have to look at it from a global perspective. I mean, if the goal is to reduce CO2 emissions, it doesn't matter what happens in Washington or Norway or South Africa, it's in its totality. And so if we are not, if the global community is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are most easily addressed at the CO2 level in some ways, then LNG or other use of gas has to be a significant priority. And I would say the same, I would say especially to our friends in the EU. I mean, you're sitting on vast amounts of shale gas. What are you waiting for? I mean, you may not need it yourself, but if lowering CO2 emissions around the world is a imperative to humanity, then don't you owe it to your neighbors to the east or the folks in Africa, South America, and so forth to bring more gas to the market? I mean, if the Japanese can perfect methane hydrates, then I mean, who knows what that means? But the point is that there is certainly an environmental argument for gas, and I think that the people who stand in the way, one has to question their ultimate motives for priorities.
Yeah, when you say, what are they waiting for, I think many are probably waiting for the United States just to export more gas, so. Yeah.
It was rhetorical.
Yeah, we have time for, so we'll collect these last two questions.
Hi, I'm Thilo Hitz. I'm an exchange student from Germany, actually. I'm studying here at American University, and I'm writing my master thesis on LNG exports from the US and what is the public interest of the US. And I wanted to ask, if you consider that shale gas is a finite resource, is it really smart and in the public interest to export huge parts of that finite resource to other countries and thereby give up the United States' own supply? What do you think of that?
Okay, and the second question?
Stanley Kober. I noticed the chart that says about demand growth. Are you so sure there's going to be that demand growth in the future? I'm looking at something from the IMF from September 18th about demand in emerging economies. And it says the medium-term outlook is, quote, worrisome. Projections have been revised down serially since 2010. This feature of repeated downward revisions to future growth is unique to the current downturn. In the past, we expected growth to bounce back, and it did. This time seems different. Now that might take us outside the parameter of just energy, but there seems to be an assumption of demand growth. How confident are you about that?
Was that economic with aggregate demand, sort of an economic sense of the IMF, or was that specific to the region? Okay. This question. Good.
Yes.
Yes.
So the first question, how can any U.S. LNG export be really in the public interest, given that it's finite? Jennifer and Chris, you want to take that very briefly?
I think you framed a question exactly in the terms that those of us who are on the side of exporting need to sort of satisfy. So the kind of protectionist sort of instinct to husband these resources is on some level understandable. I'd say maybe 2-3 things. Number one, that the environmental issues are, I think, urgent and definitely compel us to have good reasons not to export, given where the global demand for coal production is headed. And second, I do think that there's going to be, just because of the sort of production process of LNG and the sort of mechanics of shipping it from A to B and export markets, there's, as we've heard on this panel, a built-in sort of cushion for even if there's a price equivalence in terms of what the actual sort of gas itself costs coming out of Pennsylvania. The Dow Chemical and others who are using it sort of more or less on the site are going to have a massive leg up from our friends in Asia and Europe who are going to have to kind of find someone to ship it to them and then pay distributors before they actually get the benefit of that. Yes.
Just quickly, I mean, certainly any fossil fuel, any natural resource is finite by definition. But if you look at what the engineering is allowing us to pull out of the ground right now, we're talking like 5% of any one formation. That means we're leaving 95% of what is in the ground on the table because our technology hasn't evolved to that point yet. I mean, just given modern technology and modern demand, which is certainly going to change, especially as we move into the President's Climate Action Plan, but just given modern demand, you're talking about well in excess of 200 years of this supply based on current technologies. Again, I'm not saying it's going to go on forever, but we have a lot more to go. And just from a pure national interest standpoint, when you look at the pros and cons across the entire economy and you see a net benefit, I mean, that's the most fundamental reason why it's in the public interest. Because we have the resource, It's a net benefit to export it. We've talked about many other reasons why it benefits manufacturers here. And then you throw the environmental aspect on top of it too. I mean, it's a very mounting argument in the national, why it's in the public interest. Assuming that you have to meet that standard, which I would argue is still a violation of WTO.
And Andrew, very briefly, the question on the demand, I think it was on your chart.
Yeah, I mean, it's the future, who knows what's going to happen. But what we know for a fact is that we have one of the most advanced, higher rate of saturation of natural gas in our fuel mix compared with almost any other country in the world. Many of them are woefully, natural gas is woefully underrepresented. Just for example, in China, natural gas constitutes about 4% of their fuel mix. Coal is 68%. Spending time, for example, in China, it hits you in a visceral way how severe their environmental issues are. So the issue of economic growth, if the economy quits growing, you have, and to put those numbers in perspective, in the U.S. we have about 30% natural gas penetration. Coal is about 20%. So for China to get where we're going, where we are, is going to require Herculean effort, regardless if their economy, if it stops growing. There's still tremendous growth there. There's examples of this really all over the world. I mean, just look at the Caribbean, for example, Puerto Rico. 75% of the power generation is from fuel. It's dirty, it's expensive, it makes your economy non-competitive, and it's got dire health consequences. I mean, for example, if Puerto Rico was a state, they have the highest asthma rate in the country. These things are connected. So, I guess the point I'm getting to is that even if we don't have breakneck growth around the world, we know that natural gas is underrepresented in a lot of economies. So there's a lot of tremendous growth potential just to increase its presence.
We have seen in the European context a bit of a problem because with the Eurozone crisis, demand is sort of sagging right now, and the only way to effectively supply Europe in a moment of crisis is to, basically build up capacity. And unless, our friends in Berlin want to provide financial incentives to build spare capacity, that's not going to get used unless Mr. Putin gets angry at something. I don't necessarily see a way around it.
Okay, thanks. We're out of time, so please join me in thanking the panelists for excellent.